Rome. The name itself echoes with the tramp of legions, the proclamations of emperors, and the whispers of senators in marble halls. It was a civilization built on order, on law, and on the absolute certainty of its divine favor. Its power was projected by the sword and the eagle, symbols of a dominion that stretched from the mists of Britannia to the sands of Mesopotamia. But the true heart of Rome's perceived invincibility was not kept on the battlefield. It was guarded here, in a small, circular temple in the heart of the Forum. Inside, a fire burned. A fire that was never allowed to die. This was the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home, and its eternal flame was the guarantee of Rome's own eternity. And the women charged with this sacred task, the Vestal Virgins, were the most revered women in the entire empire. They were symbols of purity, piety, and the spiritual foundation of the state. They were granted privileges and powers no other woman could dream of. But this golden cage came at a terrible price. For these priestesses, held as sacrosanct, faced a punishment for failure so uniquely horrifying, it was designed by the state to be the ultimate expression of terror. This is the story of what happened when Rome's most sacred women were accused of the ultimate sin. A story not of myth, but of law, politics, and a chillingly methodical ritual. A story that ends in a cramped, dark chamber, sealed beneath the earth. The journey of a Vestal Virgin began not with a choice, but with a capture. The ceremony was called capere, and its meaning was literal, to be seized. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would select a girl from a patrician family, between the ages of 6 and 10. He would take her by the hand and utter the ancient formula, "I take you, a martyr, to be a Vestal priestess." In that moment, her childhood ended. She was severed from her family, her name was changed, and her life was sworn to the goddess for the next 30 years. The claim that these women were the most powerful in Rome is not an exaggeration. The evidence is woven into the very fabric of Roman law. Upon her induction, a Vestal was immediately freed from patria potestas, the absolute authority her father held over the family. She could own property, write a will, and conduct business in her own name, freedoms denied to nearly all other Roman women. When she traveled through the city, a lictor, the official state bodyguard, cleared a path before her, a symbol of authority reserved for the highest magistrates. If she encountered a criminal being led to execution, she had the power to issue an immediate pardon, no questions asked. The historian Plutarch notes that her testimony in court was given without the customary oath, as her word was considered incorruptible. She was, in law and in spirit, elevated above the ordinary plane of Roman life. But these privileges were merely a reflection of their true, terrifying responsibility. Their primary duty was singular, to ensure the sacred fire of Vesta never, ever went out. This was not merely a symbolic task. The Romans believed the flame was intrinsically linked to the life of the city. If the fire was extinguished, it was a horrifying omen, a sign that the gods had abandoned Rome and the city itself would fall. The historian Livy records several instances where the accidental extinguishing of the flame sent the entire city into a state of panicked religious purification. The Vestal responsible for such a lapse was taken to a dark room, stripped of her robes, and scourged by the Pontifex Maximus. It was a brutal punishment, but it was nothing compared to the penalty for the other, greater crime. The source of a Vestal's power was her vow of absolute chastity for 30 years. Her purity was Rome's purity. A breach of this vow was therefore not a personal failing. It was crimen incesti, a religious pollution that contaminated the entire state. It was an act of divine treason. And the punishment for this treason was born from a chilling legal paradox. A Vestal Virgin was sacrosanct, her body was sacred to the goddess, and therefore, her blood could not be spilled by human hands. To execute her with a sword or by strangulation would be an unforgivable sacrilege. And so, the meticulous, legalistic minds of the Roman priesthood engineered a solution, a punishment that technically avoided the act of killing, while ensuring a death of unimaginable horror. The evidence for this ritual is detailed in the accounts of historians like Dionysius of Halicarnassus. The condemned Vestal was to be buried alive. She would be taken to a place known as the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness. There, a small, subterranean chamber had been prepared. It was not an empty tomb. Inside, the state placed a small couch, a lit lamp, and a meager portion of food. A loaf of bread, a pitcher of water, a container of milk, and a little oil. This was the core of the state's cruel logic. By providing the necessities of life, the Pontifex Maximus could claim that Rome was not directly killing her. They were simply sealing her in a room, and if she died, it was the will of the gods, who had chosen to withdraw their support. She was left to her fate, entombed in the suffocating darkness, to slowly perish from starvation, dehydration, or asphyxiation as the lamp consumed the last of her oxygen. It was a death sentence delivered by legal loophole. The execution itself was a citywide spectacle of psychological theater. The condemned Vestal was stripped of her holy vestments. She was bound, and a gag was placed in her mouth, not to prevent her from speaking, but to stifle any curses she might scream against the city that had condemned her. She was then placed in a closed litter, a funeral carriage, and carried through the silent streets of the Forum. Roman law forbade burials within the city walls, so this procession was a horrifying anomaly. As Dionysius describes it, the entire city would fall silent. Shops closed. The streets emptied. Romans would follow the procession in absolute quiet, not in mourning, but in terror. They were witnessing the state surgically removing a divine poison from its heart. The Vestal, still alive, was already being treated as a ghost. But the claim that these executions were always about a broken vow of chastity is a naive one. The historical evidence strongly suggests that the purity of the Vestals was, more often than not, a political tool. The state did not waste such a powerful ritual on mere matters of the heart, it used it to manage crises. In 216 BC, Rome suffered its most catastrophic defeat at the hands of Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were slaughtered. The city was gripped by panic and religious terror. The gods, it was clear, were angry. A scapegoat was needed, a grand gesture of purification to appease the heavens. The historian Livy records that 2 Vestal Virgins, Epimia and Floronia, were promptly accused of incastity and found guilty. One was buried alive. The other took her own life to escape the same fate. Their deaths were a calculated political act, designed to redirect public fear and restore faith in the state's piety. The system's cruelty was not reserved for the women alone. The man accused of being a Vestal's lover, the Pontifex Stupri, faced a different, but equally brutal, public death. He was taken to the Comitium, a public space in the Forum, stripped naked, his neck locked in a wooden fork, and flogged to death by the Pontifex Maximus himself. The act was a public display of the state reasserting control, washing away the spiritual stain with the blood of the accused. The contrast was stark. The woman's death was silent, hidden, and suffocating. The man's was loud, public, and violent. Both served the same purpose, to reinforce the absolute power of the state's moral authority. Perhaps no one wielded this terrible power more cynically than the Emperor Domitian. A tyrant known for his paranoia and cruelty, Domitian sought to portray himself as a restorer of ancient Roman morals. To prove his piety, he launched a series of investigations into the Vestal order. The historian Suetonius tells us he condemned several Vestals, allowing them to choose their manner of death. But for the chief Vestal, Cornelia, he revived the ancient, horrifying ritual of live burial. The writer Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the events, describes the case with deep skepticism. He recounts how Cornelia maintained her innocence to the very end. As she was being led to her doom, her robes caught on a step. When the executioner offered a hand to help, she recoiled, as if to preserve her physical purity even in her final moments. Pliny questions the validity of the trial, suggesting it was a show trial orchestrated by Domitian to create an atmosphere of terror and display his absolute power. Cornelia's entombment was not about justice, it was about sending a message. No one, not even Rome's most sacred priestess, was safe from the emperor's reach. The Vestal Virgins of Rome occupied a space between divinity and damnation. They were granted freedoms and reverence unparalleled for women in the ancient world, yet they lived under the constant shadow of a fate worse than a quick death. Their bodies were not their own, they were state property, barometers of Rome's divine favor. Their purity was a resource to be managed, and when necessary, to be sacrificed for the stability of the state. The true horror of their existence was not the vow of celibacy, but the knowledge that their piety could be turned against them at any moment. A whispered rumor, a political plot, a military defeat, any of these could be enough to trigger an accusation. The trial that followed was often a formality, the verdict preordained. The archaeological evidence for the Campus Celeratus is elusive, but the textual evidence from the Romans themselves is undeniable. They knew of this place. They recorded the rituals. They understood its purpose. Imagine the final moments. The sound of the stone being rolled into place, sealing the entrance. The sudden, absolute silence. The chilling air growing colder, thinner. The only companion, a single flame, consuming the very air needed to breathe. The fire they were sworn to protect was a symbol of Rome's eternal life. But the small, trembling flame in that underground tomb was a cruel mockery, a final, flickering reminder of a life that was about to be extinguished, forgotten by the very city she was born to serve. The chronicles may have recorded her crime, but it is the silence of the earth that holds the truth of her terror.